I started playing Final Fantasy XIV a while ago because a lot of people really loved that game, and I thought it was amazing in some ways, but it also fell short of my expectations. And I just tried to love it, but I really couldn't quite get into it. But one of the main things that turned me off from Final Fantasy XIV is that the open world activities just feel very, very lacking. You'll log into the game, at least for me, it was this way. I'd log into the game and then I would think, well, okay, what do I want to go do? And if I wanted to queue up for a dungeon, then that would be fine. I could do that. Or if I wanted to do main story quest, then I could do that. But outside of hanging out in a city or going to go do some more main story quests or queuing up for a dungeon, it just felt like there was not really any compelling reason, to go out into the open world. And it's true, you can go do crafting quests and you can level up your character as a crafter, and that seems really cool, until you realize that if you want to go mining, you're going to go find one of a very small number of nodes. It always feels like you're just going to the same places to do your gathering. And then when you're crafting, it feels like it's very menu driven. It doesn't feel interactive. You don't have this sense of progression. You don't have this sense of it being rewarding. It just feels like you're fighting a lot of menus to grind, and there's not really a sense of satisfaction. At least that's how I felt. So the lack of open world activities, being a player who really likes to just be able to go out into the world and explore randomly, really turned me off. And then to add to that, I felt like the story is overrated. Now, I know that some people like the story of Final Fantasy XIV, and more power to them, but I'm not one of those people. I just couldn't get into it. And no matter how much I tried, the story felt boring as all get out to me. I like more of a traditional fantasy style in storytelling. I like more of something that sounds like it came out of maybe more like Dungeons and Dragons, or something that's like medieval with a touch of high fantasy, but relatable in a way that just makes sense. Something that feels like it's out of every fairy tale and fantasy environment you've ever imagined as a kid reading, fairy stories. Like that kind of a down to earth fantasy that seems familiar is not Final Fantasy XIV. 14 is some sort of a weird style of fantasy that's a mixture of Western fantasy and weeb fantasy. It's kind of weird. It's an acquired taste, I would say, but it just felt foreign enough that it didn't really ever click with me. And I think this is important to talk about because I think there's a lot of hype that surrounds games sometimes, and there was a lot of hype that surrounded Final Fantasy XIV. People just acted like it can do no wrong, and no question, it's the absolute best MMO on the market. And if you say anything else about it, then you are, enemy number one. And that leads me to one of my other problems that I've had with Final Fantasy XIV, which is actually a turnoff, and it's kind of weird. But the best way I can describe it is toxic positivity. It's that sugary-sweet attitude of a player base that is so obsessed with that one game that they kind of treat it like it's a religion. And if you don't like the game enough, then you're an enemy. And that tribalism, that tendency to be so obsessed with the game that it just doesn't feel normal, is kind of off-putting. And I think if you're so obsessed with being inclusive that you make that your actual brand, then you lose your identity along the way, because everybody's just trying to prove that their game is so awesome, and their community is so perfect, but it's not. It's, I guess, kind of smug and unrelatable on some level once you scratch beneath the surface. And so there's a few things that are really amazing about Final Fantasy XIV, like character customization, for example. Absolutely top-notch. Player housing is really amazing if you discount the fact that it's stuck behind an enormous wall of grinding to unlock and access that feature of the game. The community, if you exclude the weirdness and the elitism of it, is pretty good. There's a lot of good things about the community of Final Fantasy XIV that make it feel like a welcoming and well-rounded community. It's just, it's kind of like Kool-Aid. You have a little bit of it, and it's great. You have a whole gallon of it, and it starts to feel like it's not healthy. Because sugar water is not a valid replacement for juice, right? That's kind of how I see the Final Fantasy XIV community. It's good, but it's also a little bit disingenuous because it tries too hard. So I just struggled to get into Final Fantasy XIV. I wanted to, really did, because there's so much cool stuff about the game. But I just couldn't get past that sense that the community is super weeby and kind of weird, and it's like it's got so much kind of counterculture going for it. Like I want to see a community that's inclusive of all different kinds of people, right? But if every time I log in, it seems like the main thing that's happening in the game is some kind of a not safe for work gay nightclub role play or something, I just don't, that's not my thing, right? If you say role play, I want it to be like, like a Dungeons and Dragons style of role play, like get into the lore of the world and kind of, that kind of stuff, not, some kind of an ERP kind of thing. Like that's not, that's fine. I think it's cool if that kind of stuff's happening in a game, because I like to see a well-rounded community that includes all kinds of different play styles and all sorts of different ways that players have interacting with each other. But if it starts to get to the point where it feels like that's the actual identity of the game on a primary level, then that's a turnoff to me, because it's not really inclusive of a well-rounded, normal subset of society. It's like it's a niche that has become mainstream in the game. Well, then all the normal players kind of are going to want to distance themselves a little bit, I think. So that's kind of where I'm at with Final Fantasy XIV. It's a good game, amazing game in some ways, but then there's a few things that really just ruin the experience for me. Probably at the top of the list is the feeling that the world is not open and explorable in the way I want it to be. And that's just a personal taste. But anyway, that brings me to Albion Online, another favorite game that I think is an amazing title. And I have put a lot of hours into Albion Online, and I will always say good things about Albion Online because it has this really realistic economy. And there's something super cool about the idea of going out into the world, collecting resources, turning those resources into finished products, selling them on a player-driven market, having a full loot system that drives supply and demand, and you just have this sense that it's realistic. And you can't really replicate that exactly with a economy that doesn't have item sinks in the style of a full loot drop on death game. I like Albion Online because, in a sense, there is no grind. Depending how you look at it, you could say it's a super grindy game, but you could also say there is no grind because there's no quests, there's no objective, there is no actual end game to reach other than whatever objectives you might have for yourself. So if you don't have any objectives in Albion Online, you can just log in and do whatever, because it's not like there's any point at which you're going to be able to say, well, I got to Endgame. It just is what it is. And that absence of quests in Albion Online is both a positive and a negative. It's a positive in the sense that it doesn't compel you to feel like you have to play an endless amount of time to get through all this content. It's a negative in the sense that there isn't any content. So if you're looking for any kind of quests or world building or lore, it's just not there. And then that leads me to the final reason why maybe it's not good, and that is the toxic community. And I will say that hands down, out of all the games I've encountered, I have not found any game that has a more terrible, toxic, and unfriendly player base than Albion Online. Hands down. You will log into that game and all you will see is a slew of sexism, racism, political stuff, and sexual innuendo all mixed together in a indecipherable slurry of trolling. That's exactly what Albion Online is. Now, that's not to say that you can't get into a guild and you can't meet good people in the game, of course. But if you were to judge the game based on what you see in global chat, that's what you would see. And that's not the case for every MMO. It's really kind of just the case for that one. It's really kind of weird, but it's a mixture of the full loot play style, the free-to-play model, a lack of moderation, and when you combine it with the fact that people from all over the world are playing this game, it's just really, really toxic. And that doesn't bother me. But if you're going to play an MMO, why play an MMO that is filled with the kind of people that you would not want to interact with? If you have to turn off the chat box because it's so continually obnoxious and offensive that the only way you can focus on the game is to actually minimize it just so that you don't see it continually, why pick that game when there's so many other ones out there that don't have that problem? And for me, the answer to that has been, well, I'll pick that game because I like the player-driven economy. I like other aspects of the game, so I'll just ignore the fact that the players are kind of crazy. That's fine. But then I've also kind of got to the point where I feel like I don't want to sink my time into a whole bunch of different games that are all a variation of the same kind of activity. If I'm going to be gathering materials, crafting things, selling things in an MMO, I kind of want it just to be one MMO. I don't need to do that in one MMO and then sign out and then go do it in another MMO. Like, I think once is enough. One big time sink is enough. And that's where I kind of have sort of thought, maybe Albion Online is just something I just need to kind of let it go. So that has put me in a situation where I've realized you kind of have two different kinds of problem. You have the problem of theme park MMOs, some of the problems that we see in a game like Final Fantasy XIV. And then you have the problems of full loot sandbox MMOs. And those are a totally different kind of problem. Which leads me to Elder Scrolls Online. And I started playing Elder Scrolls Online after trying most of the other MMOs out there. And I'm not going to say that ESO is the best out of all of them. But what I will say is that it seems like it has the best balance overall. It's not the best in the sense that if you take any one particular mechanic and you say what game does the best job of this, I can probably find another game that does a better job. For example, in some ways, Final Fantasy XIV has better character customization and maybe better housing. In some ways, we might be able to say that Albion Online has a better player-driven economy. And yet, the reality is that ESO strikes a good balance of a lot of things. It's that well-rounded middle way that offers something reasonable to every playstyle. And it tries to address, in some way, all of the objections that I have with other MMOs. In ESO, the open world activities are abundant. You can log into the game and just head off in some unknown direction to see what adventure you find. And wherever you go, you'll find things to gather that you can use for crafting and selling. You'll find other players milling around. You'll have opportunities for interaction. You'll find quests that you can just pick up because you encounter some NPC that says, hey, I want you to do something. So maybe the world is not as immersive as some single-player RPGs. For example, Genshin Impact has an amazing world that is not instanced or segregated in any way. But then Genshin Impact is not a MMO. ESO's maps are not all connected seamlessly. They are segregated zones, but the zones are big, and the sense of exploration is pretty good. Quests are 100% optional. They're all 100% voiced. And if you want to dive into the lore, the Elder Scrolls lore is quite abundant. But then you also don't really have to. If you just want to wander around catching fish, you could do that too. And that would be fine. Level scaling in ESO eliminates grind. Now that's a contentious issue because the downside of level scaling is it creates a sense that the whole world is kind of easy, and it eliminates a sense of getting more powerful. It eliminates a sense of challenge in some cases. But it also makes a game where people of all levels can play together. It creates an environment where from the first day you create an account and log on, you can go to any map in the world and explore and see the sights of Tamriel. You don't have to level up to level 60 before you can unlock the DLC that's going to let you go to some particular zone. And those kinds of things probably outweigh the negatives of feeling like level scaling eliminates difficulty. The player base in ESO is balanced. It's mature. It's diverse. You'll find people of all different play styles in ESO. You'll find economy players who want to make money in the game. You'll find cosmetic players that want to make their characters look a certain way. You'll find competitive players that are focused on PvP. You'll find role players that want to just RP and are not worried about the rest of the game content. You'll have people dedicated to player housing. There's a lot of different types of players in ESO, and in my experience, it seems like they come from all different political spectrums and all different age groups. I've played with people who are teenagers and people who are retired in their 60s, people who are probably liberal and people who are probably conservative. And it feels like there's a good, healthy mix of all different kinds of people. Kind of like if you went out into your community and just found a subset, a cross-section of society. You'd have all different kinds of people. Not just one group that has become the dominant representation of the game. And that's really refreshing because it feels like, as a general rule, the people you encounter in ESO are the kind of people you would be comfortable inviting over to your house or hanging out with for a 4th of July barbecue. Just normal people. And I like that. It's something that makes me feel more comfortable in the game. Player housing is good. Maybe it's not as good as Final Fantasy XIV in some ways, but the truth is it's very accessible compared to Final Fantasy XIV. You can casually play the game in ESO and have access to player housing early in your ESO career. In Final Fantasy XIV, you'll still be grinding and hoping that one day you're going to be able to get a house. But the problem with Final Fantasy is buying a house in there is almost as difficult as buying a house in real life. You not only have to level up a lot, you also have to be lucky enough to win a roulette so that you can even have a chance to buy one of the limited numbers of properties in the game. ESO just gives you access to all sorts of houses all over Tamriel, and many of them you can acquire for gold that you earn in the game. You don't have to get them through the crown store or anything like that. Some you do, but plenty of them you don't. Unlike Final Fantasy XIV, ESO officially supports add-ons. In Final Fantasy XIV, if you are caught with add-ons, you could technically be banned. That's kind of a turnoff. If I want an add-on so that I can see the average market price or value of an item, I don't want to risk my account getting banned for that. And I really shouldn't. And I think that that's something that Bethesda has really done well. If you want add-ons, they support it. There's an actual menu in the game where you can manage your add-ons. You don't have to hide them from the developer. They understand players want to do add-ons and mods for the game, and they support it. And I really like that. It's true the player-driven economy is not as well-rounded as what you'd find in Albion Online or EVE Online, but you can definitely find unique ways to make money in the game. You can play the economy in ESO, and so if your goal is to make money and have a sense of progression that way, you can absolutely do that. If you want to be a PvPer, that's a viable play style. Lots of people are PvP focused in Elder Scrolls Online. Unlike some games that are extremely focused on PvP at the expense of PvE, or which maybe don't offer PvP at all, or offer it in such a terrible condition that no one would even actually use it. ESO does try to offer both worlds. So if you want to be a totally solo PvE player, there's a place for you. And if you want to be a primarily competitive PvP player, there's a place for you too. The mega server in ESO is nice. You never have to worry about what server you're on to play with somebody else. You can just play with them because it's all one mega server. There's other things that are nice about ESO, like the way towns and cities are designed. There's so many towns and cities sprinkled all over this enormous world. And they all have lots of buildings you can go into, with NPCs you can interact with. There's big cities, there's little towns. And that's something that's always been a pet peeve of mine in MMOs. It's supposed to be this vast, enormous world. Then you log in, and you realize that there's just a couple player hubs, and there's not even any buildings that you can go inside. It just feels like a terrible injustice when you want to go into a city, and then you realize it's just a facade. Pets, companions, mounts, those are all pretty cool in Elder Scrolls Online. And I know some people will criticize the monetization model, and that's probably fair. But it's not a pay-to-win system like what you would find in maybe a game like Lost Ark or Black Desert Online. It's not predatory in that way. You can have fun with the game by just buying the base game. But there's also the opportunity to have cosmetic pets and mounts and companions you unlock. And all of that contributes to immersion in the solo experience. Finally, I would say that guilds are an amazing contribution in ESO, because there's so many different kinds of guilds. You can just find one that fits your personality and your playstyle. There's guilds that are just there so that you can have a place to sell your things. There's guilds that are focused on competitive play. There's role-play guilds. There's social guilds. If you just want to connect to a community of people who probably have an open Discord and share cat photos 5 days out of the week, you can find that kind of a guild in ESO. And you can join up to 5 guilds at any given time. So having a lot of different guild options really opens up the community in a way that I don't think very many other MMOs do. For example, take Albion Online. Because everything is a numbers game in Albion, you wind up not joining a guild, or you join a guild that has membership requirements. They want you to be there to do specific play activities, to go participate in some particular content. And then it feels like joining a guild is like taking a second job, and that's not fun, especially if you're a casual player that just wants to log in after a long day of work and enjoy the game. So where does that leave us? Well, ESO is not perfect. Economy isn't as realistic as what you'd get in a full loot game. Some aspects of character customization are not as fleshed out as Final Fantasy XIV. Level scaling sometimes makes leveling feel kind of pointless, and combat feel kind of flat. The segregated zones sometimes make me wish that ESO's world was a little bit more seamless, like some single-player RPGs I've played. But at the end of the day, ESO feels respectable. It feels like that relationship that's not absolutely perfect in every way, but it's trustworthy. It feels like ESO tries to have some answer to most of the problems that plague the genre. And by trying to meet in the middle, sometimes it fails to hit the high notes we wish it would have touched on. But it also doesn't have the lows. It doesn't have the overt negatives that make me feel turned off by other games. For example, the toxic community of Albion Online. Or maybe the toxic positivity of Final Fantasy XIV. or the pay-to-win mechanics of something like Black Desert Online, or Genshin Impact's casino style of gacha. And it's frankly refreshing to feel like the game that I'm playing is wholesome. I think that the wholesome element makes up for the shortfalls. Kind of like that trustworthy relationship that isn't totally fireworks all the time, but it's good on a fundamental level. After everything I've experienced, from shallow MMOs to flawed MMOs, to MMOs that are really good in some ways and really terrible in others, to games like Final Fantasy XIV that are so hyped up, but if I'm honest, they're not really a good fit for me. ESO feels like a place that's not a terrible one to call home. And I would encourage anybody to give it a try. I think it's a really well-rounded game. And it's a franchise that has been going for decades now, which is maybe reason enough to give it some respect. It's not a new kid on the block. And with Elder Scrolls 6 coming out eventually, it's also probably not going anywhere. And I do feel like it's got a good community, and it's got a good dev team that's engaged with the community. Hearing that there's going to probably be an Elder Scrolls Online physical meetup next year is really cool. Watching a dev stream where they start off by telling you how to make cabbage cakes by hand is cool. And it doesn't really have to be perfect. Maybe that's one of our problems. We're always looking for the perfect game. We're looking for the perfect relationship. And we get so distracted by the high notes that we overlook the things that are simply good. And then we wonder why we're always disappointed. In the case of ESO, I think it is simply good, and probably worth a try. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm never going to play any other MMOs. I'm not saying that, because I don't want to box myself in. And it's totally possible that I will want to scratch the itch with some other title. But I'm just sharing my thoughts on this, because after a lot of hours of thinking about MMOs and experimenting with them, I have to say ESO kind of feels like it might be the one that I want to stick around with as my main game for quite a while. Guess we'll see. Anyway, feel free to share your thoughts on MMOs. What do you think is the best one out there? What have your experiences been with MMOs? If you've made it this far, thank you. And till next time, thank you for watching. Bye now.